What's up guys, this is SkyTech Freak and today I just want to do a short video upgrading the graphics card in this Zotac Magnus One from the RTX 3070 to the latest generation RTX 4070, and this is also a model made by Zotac known as the Twin Edge OC. So I'm interested to see what kind of performance we gain by upgrading that 3070 to the 4070. But before we do that, I also want to talk about some of the CPU cooling changes I've made in the Zotac Magnus One. Now, I don't know if you guys saw my last video regarding Zotac Magnus One, but I had bought the 3070 and i7 model, and basically I was considering downgrading the 10700 that I had in this PC to maybe a 10400 or a 10500 i5 processor instead of the i7 processor. The reason for that is that this case would just become really hot and really noisy. The top fans and the CPU cooler, especially the fan on the CPU cooler, would just ramp up so loudly, and it would continue to thermal throttle despite that, that it was becoming very difficult to sort of run any sort of games or do any sort of high productivity work on this machine. To sort of counter that issue, I did go ahead and purchase the NH-L9i by Noctua, and that did drastically reduce the sort of sound or the sound noise that the CPU fan cooler was making, but it only gave sort of a marginal increase in performance. So while the noise issue was largely eliminated, especially the noise coming from the CPU cooler, I still felt that the 10700, the i7 processor in this, was being thermal throttled. And so I thought about it a little bit more and I wanted to find a better solution. So I just want to show you guys what kind of modifications I've done to sort of mitigate that problem and try to get the Magnus One to run cooler with the 10700 installed without having to downgrade to an i5 part. So yeah, let's jump in and see what kind of handiwork and modifications I've done to this case. So I realized that even after eliminating the noise that was coming from Zotac's crappy pre-installed CPU cooler, the top fans, these top two 92mm slim fans on the Zotac Magnus One, were also making a lot of noise and ramping up really fast without being able to move that much air. So something that people online recommend is switching out those top two fans for Noctua A9 into 14 slim 92mm fans. So that's something that I did, and you'll see how I installed them in just a second. So what I've done is actually routed, and if you guys can see this PWM splitter cable here that I'm just going to remove when I take off the top cover, what I did is actually install those two fans. So I took out the two Zotac fans that come on top, and I also removed that magnetic cable channel, and instead what I've done is just used zip ties and pre-existing cable channels on the top cover to install these two 92mm Noctua fans, and then I've used a PWM splitter so that we can use this into the CPU fan header. So while the Zotac Magnus One doesn't have a dedicated PWM case fan header, I've used a PWM splitter to sort of use the single CPU fan header that it has to run all the fans in my case. Now, something I had to consider while doing these sort of customizations and modifications to the Magnus One was the cost involved, right? I had already bought a pretty expensive low profile CPU cooler from Noctua. We already know Noctua components don't come cheap, and that of course stands true for their fans as well. So on top of buying that CPU cooler, having to buy then two more of these NF-A9 14 fans, which are almost as costly as the low profile cooler itself, was becoming a little bit, hard to swallow in terms of the expenditure. At the same time, I realized that the 10700 thermal throttling wasn't only because of the CPU die itself, but it was also because of inadequate cooling on the VRMs of the motherboard, which was also lending to thermal throttling of the i7 Intel part. So I was thinking about a solution for both those things, and luckily I found one that kills two birds with one stone. So instead of buying another NF-A9 into 14, so I bought one of these fans and a second one that already comes with the low profile cooler. So if you harvest the fan that comes with the low profile cooler, it's the same one as the A9 into 14. And so I used those two on the top cover that I showed you already here on top, as the top exhaust fans. And so you guys are probably wondering that if I've used both the 92mm fans as top exhaust on this Magnus One, then what fan exactly have I used on the CPU cooler? And as you guys can see, what I've actually used instead of a 92mm fan is a full 120mm slim fan by Arctic. So this is the Arctic P12 Slim. We already know Arctic has some really great fans. They are also comparable to Noctua and compete with Noctua in terms of performance and quality quite regularly. And the way I did that is, as you can see, I still have the NHL9i installed behind this fan. So the cooler that's still installed here is Noctua's low profile cooler. But what I've done is used one screw hole to install the fan from the right side. And I've used mounting points near heat sinks and VRMs on the motherboard and used zip ties to sort of hold this fan together. So as you can see, even though it's only held into place by a screw on the top right, it's still held into place on other mounting points as well in a way that it can't move. And the reason I opted to use a 120mm fan, besides it being much cheaper than a new Noctua A9X14, the P12 Slim is actually much cheaper. That's one of the USPs of Arctic. They make slim performance fans that are, not expensive. But the reason I used a 120mm fan is that if you can see closely here, that the CPU cooler sort of ends out over here, but what's still under the fan over here and over here are those same VRMs that I was talking about that were getting hot and thermal throttling the PC. So using this 120mm fan, I've actually been able to eliminate some of the VRM heating that was happening and some of the thermal throttling that's occurring because of that. Another thing that's interesting with the P12 is that each of the P12 fans, whether they're the slim ones or the 140mm or the 120mm ones, come with a PWM splitter. So instead of using a three-way splitter in which I'd have to put one into the CPU fan and two on the top exhaust, I've just had to use one dual splitter in which I've connected both the Noctua fans to themselves, and then instead of having to have that third one, it's the single splitter that goes into the pre-installed or the pre-existing splitter that's on the P12. And that way all I have to do is plug this in when I use the top panel, and then we can have all three fans working through the single CPU fan header cable that's over here. And now that I've explained how I dealt with some of the thermal throttling that was happening in the Zotac Magnus One without downgrading my CPU from an i7 to an i5 part, let's do what we actually came here to do, and that is upgrade the GPU from the RTX 3070 to the brand new RTX 4070. So first, let's get this 3070 out of the way. If you guys have never actually removed the GPU from your Zotac Magnus One, here's how you do that. There's a screw that comes here which holds the card down. So you just want to remove that screw first. And then what you have is a lever similar to sort of the levers that are there in motherboards that you need to push down while you pull the card upwards. So I'm going to use my middle finger to just push down on that and then shimmy the card out. And out it comes. And lastly, of course, you do have to remove the 8-pin power cables. Now, something that I find really irritating about this 3070 specifically is just how deep these power cables actually go in, like how deep set the PCIe power cable slots are in this 3070. It's a very tall card, and I'll do a little bit of a comparison when I unbox the 4070 as well, just to see the height difference. But it's such a deep cut that you have to sort of make sure your cables go through, and it's not always easy to get it lined up because a lot of PSU cables have 6+2 instead of like 8 straight power connectors, and just generally like having to shove your hand in here with these like sharp angles of metal all around, the likelihood of cutting yourself or just not being able to get it in easily is very high. So I know this sounds like a really annoying nitpick, but it was something that I really disliked. And I'm sure a lot of you don't actually change out your graphics cards as much as I do, so this is not something that's going to bother you, but I will say I welcome the much shorter 4070 with a single 8-pin that's not going to have this gulf of 8 pins causing me the same problem. So yeah, let's take a look at that 4070 now. We've got the box right here. Quick comparison to the 3070 will show you that it's actually a much shorter card. Like I was saying, the height is much lower, and most importantly, no massive gulf or hole to plug in 8-pin power connectors. Just an easy on the surface process, which I greatly appreciate. I do really like the new design of the Zotac cards for the 40 series, this sort of rounded spaceship or skateboard type look, as opposed to their earlier angular edgy cards like the Trinity and the Twin Edge. But enough of talking about last generation's cards. Let's install the latest Gen 4070 and see what kind of performance we get out of that. So as you can see, instead of a dual 8-pin, it's just a single 8-pin in this generation. We'll move the second unneeded 8-pin to the side. Make sure we have our PCIe slot lined up, and then just click that back in. I'm sure you guys heard that click. But you can once again see that 120mm fan covering not only the CPU cooler, but also the VRM heat sinks down at the bottom and on the left side. I just wanted to show you guys what plugging that in looks like. So I just have this already routed from between the fans, and I actually have these two covers so that none of the wiring hits the fans, stopping them from moving. These fan grills that come with the Magnus One, and then I just have to plug that in. It's as simple as that. It's not a difficult plug. Removing it is also just as easy, and then plugging it back is also just as easy as that. Of course, not as easy as a magnetic connection, but you know, for DIY performance, these are things that you have to start doing. So yeah, let me get this computer plugged in now and see what the performance looks like. So I got done testing the Magnus One with both cards, and essentially what the performance uplift boils down to from the 4070 to the 3070 is that in terms of raw benchmarks and graphical processing, the Magnus One with the 4070 is about 18 to 20% faster than the Magnus One with the 3070. And when it comes to games that support NVIDIA's special features like DLSS 2 and DLSS 3, which includes frame generation, that performance can go up to 25 to 28%. Now, another thing that I wanted to mention is that the Magnus One is still running a 3-generation old processor, right? So you can only get it with a 10500 or a 10700, and I guess you could upgrade that to a 10900 at best. But that will severely thermal throttle as well, just like my 10700 was thermal throttling. And something that's even more detrimental to performance is that the RAM is limited to a maximum speed of 3000 megahertz. So you can't get a 3200 megahertz set or a 3600 megahertz set in the sense that you can buy them and install them, but they'll be downclocked to 3000 megahertz and limited to 3000 megahertz only, and that does hurt the performance. So something that's interesting is that even though these cards have shown a pretty big difference in performance from one generation to another in the Magnus One, what is also important to know is that these exact same cards proportionally perform about 15% worse in the Magnus One than they would perform in sort of a 5800X 3D system that I tested them in. And the reason for that is obviously going to be that downclocked RAM speed, the older generation processors, and of course the fact that this is a small form factor PC also contributes to that lower performance, clearly because there's less room for cooling, less room for airflow, and as a result thermals suffer and we get thermal throttling. So these are the reasons as to why the Magnus One performs about 15% worse than an ideal test bench with the same exact graphics card. So before I end this video, I also wanted to show you guys what these top fans look like while they're spinning in the system and how I have them connected to that PWM CPU fan header. So as you can see, here is the connection, that connecting point I showed you guys earlier, and you can see both the Noctua fans are spinning and spinning quite silently, if I might say so. So keep in mind, if you do this upgrade, you're still leaving about 15% of the performance that you could have had with a better system on the table. But if you guys are dedicated to that small form factor PC life, you guys know what kind of cons come with it and what kind of compromises you have to make. And at the end of the day, in a PC this size, there isn't a faster GPU that you can have. And please let me know what kind of modifications you guys might have made to your Zotac Magnus One or other small form factor PCs, and if any of the changes I've made inspired you guys to maybe try the same thing. Let me know if you will be upgrading your Zotac Magnus One from a 3070 or 3060 to the 4070. And that's all for now. Thanks guys, see you in the next one.